My girlfriend Nancy and I were invited to a housewarming party. Our friends had recently bought a house and wanted to celebrate it over the weekend. We drove out to see them and brought our Labrador with us. His name was Buddy. Later, I would deeply regret that decision. Buddy was an incredibly friendly, happy dog. He loved people and could walk up to anyone like he'd known them his whole life. We took him almost everywhere with us, but this time, especially, our friends had a large property with a wide, open lawn, no cramped yard, no fences right up against the neighbors. The street where the house was located was extremely quiet. The houses were spaced far apart from each other. It was a sunny day. We went outside, set up chairs, and our friends fired up the grill. Next to our friend's house stood an old neighboring home. It looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. Darkened wooden boards, heavy curtains in the windows, a porch with crooked steps. Our friends said an elderly couple lived there, but in the week they'd been in their new house, they had only seen them once. Buddy ran around the yard, sniffing the grass, running back to check on us, then taking off again. Sometimes I threw him a ball, and he'd sprint after it like a maniac. One time, after I threw the ball, he ran to the edge of the property and suddenly stopped. He stood there completely still, staring into the distance, sniffing the air. Then he started to growl. The fur along his back stood up. I had never seen Buddy like that before. A man appeared near the neighboring house. He slowly stepped onto his lawn and stopped. Thin build, long gray hair tied back in a bun. He was wearing an old, wide-brimmed hat. Buddy exploded into barking. I had never seen him that aggressive. He was usually friendly to the point of being ridiculous with people and other dogs alike. That was why his reaction felt so extreme. I couldn't understand what had set him off so badly. I tried calling Buddy. He glanced back at me, wagged his tail for a second, and then started barking even harder. I had to walk over and grab his leash. He pulled forward, straining, barking nonstop. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching us. A couple of minutes later, a woman came out to join him. She was shorter, hunched over, with a dull gray scarf wrapped around her neck. They stood there for several minutes, staring in our direction. Then they spoke briefly, turned around, and went back inside. Buddy kept growling and pulling on the leash even after they disappeared. I tried to calm him down, gripping the leash tightly and stroking his neck. After a while, he settled down, but I didn't dare let him off the leash again. As evening came, it got cooler, and our friends suggested moving inside. We cleared the table and carried everything into the living room. Buddy was still on the leash, but now he seemed calm, lying on the grass with his head resting on his paws. I thought it was over, that maybe he'd just reacted to a strange neighbor. Maybe he'd picked up some unfamiliar scent. The moment I picked up the leash, he suddenly jumped, yanked hard, and broke free. It was as if he'd been waiting for the right moment. In seconds, Buddy was running into the darkness, the leash trailing behind him, dragging through the grass. I ran after him. At first, I thought he'd just darted around the yard and would come back, but I couldn't see him anywhere. I called his name, no response. My girlfriend came over, and we stood at the edge of the property, calling for him together. That's when we heard the whimper, short, strangled, like he couldn't get enough air. It sounded close, too close. Then everything went silent. We went back inside, grabbed flashlights, and went out searching for him. The beams cut through the grass, bushes, tree trunks. We walked in circles, calling Buddy again and again. Nothing answered us. After about an hour, we gave up and went back inside. Our friends tried to calm me down. They said he'd come back. Dogs always find their way home. I listened to their words, but inside, I felt a growing sense of dread. I kept replaying that whimper in my head. Something had happened. Still, I hoped that by morning, he would return. I barely slept that night. I kept listening, hoping to hear Buddy bark, but it stayed quiet. Morning came. Buddy didn't return. We searched again, called his name, went beyond the property line. Nothing worked. I felt guilty, like I'd let a child out of my sight and lost him. When we came back, my friends and my girlfriend went inside. I sat down in a chair under a tree. My eyes drifted toward the neighboring house. I saw an old pickup truck pull away. Behind the wheel was the same man we'd seen the day before. Sitting next to him was the same gray-haired, hunched woman. That's when a terrible idea crossed my mind. I stood up and walked toward their house. There was a fence, but it wasn't very high. I walked along it until I found a spot where I could get inside. The yard looked neglected. Tall, overgrown grass, a pile of old boards leaning against the fence, a rusty barrel nearby. The air carried a strange smell, not strong, but unpleasant, like wet fur mixed with something else. I took a few steps forward and froze. In the corner of the yard, hidden from the road and from view, stood several wooden frames, roughly built, like they'd been thrown together in a hurry. Stretched across them was something my brain refused to process at first. Dogskins. More than one. I couldn't tell how many. I didn't want to look closely. Nausea rose in my throat. My heart started pounding. It was so horrific that I couldn't even fully comprehend it, and I was terrified to connect what I was seeing with Buddy's disappearance. Then I noticed a bench next to the house. A cardboard box sat on top of it. I stepped closer. I didn't want to, but my body moved on its own, like I was obligated to see what was inside. The box was filled with dog collars and leashes, different colors, different sizes, worn, some with old metal clips. Among them was Buddy's leash and his collar. I recognized them instantly, the color, the weave, the small bright lime green tag attached to his collar. I don't remember how I left that yard. I walked back quickly, without looking around. It felt like if I stayed even 1 second longer, I'd see something else, something that would break me completely. I called the police. After the call, I sat on the steps of my friend's house, staring at the road. I kept thinking about the night before, about the way Buddy had reacted to that man. He had sensed what we couldn't. He knew that person was dangerous. My name is Kala. I compose music for commercials and small films. I live and work in a city where there's always noise, even at night. Because of that, I've developed a habit. Every few weeks, I escape to the ocean, to a small house I rent from an acquaintance. I've been going there for almost 2 years. It's much easier to work there. No people, just the ocean and nature, which help me reset and enjoy the surroundings. But after my last trip, I lost the desire to go there alone. The place is in an area called Driftwood Cove, on the outskirts of the large city of Ravenport. It's less than a 2-hour drive from the city, but it feels like stepping into a different dimension. That time, I arrived closer to the evening. I parked near the house. The key was exactly where I had left it. When I opened the door, I noticed a slight mess. There was a thin line of sand on the doormat, as if someone had walked inside with wet shoes. One chair was overturned, and there were crumbs and spilled seasoning on the kitchen counter. For a few minutes, I just walked through the house, checking things. The closets were closed, the windows were shut, the locks were intact. I told myself that maybe the owner had stopped by to check on the place. After calming down a bit, I cleaned up. I wiped the counter, swept the sand off the mat, and aired out the room. Then I unpacked my things and lit a fire in the fireplace. Flames always make a place feel cozier. When I was done, I made myself some tea and stepped out onto the terrace. It was still light outside. The ocean looked dark. The air was colder than in the city, and that made me feel more awake. I stood there, listening to the water rolling onto the shore. That's when I noticed someone. He was standing on the beach below the terrace, about 30 to 40 feet from the house. He stood completely still, facing the ocean. I walked to the edge of the terrace and stopped. I tried to speak to him, said hello. The man turned toward me and looked at me. I couldn't make out his face. The light was fading and the shadows were deep. He greeted me briefly, then turned back to the ocean. I stood there for a few more minutes, watching the water and the sunset, thinking about going back inside. At that moment, the strange man turned and simply walked along the shore, disappearing into the darkness. I went back inside and told myself he was just a strange person on the beach, nothing more. I tried to focus on work, sketch out a few notes, find a rhythm. I needed to come up with new music for an ad. When it got dark, I sat by the fireplace, listening to the wood crackle. After writing down a few melodies and having another cup of tea, I decided that was enough for the day and went to bed. I added more logs to the fire, turned off the light, and tried to fall asleep. About 10 or 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps. They were coming from outside the house. Someone was walking along the terrace. The steps were careful and unhurried. Because of the thin walls, they were easy to hear. I sat up in bed and froze. Then I forced myself to get up and turn on the lamp. I wanted it to be clear that someone was inside the house. The curtains were closed, the moon was bright outside, and I saw a shadow, a male figure. The shadow passed by the window and stopped at the door. The door handle moved and pressed down. The lock clicked, but the door didn't open. I had locked it from the inside with a second lock. The unknown person pressed the handle a few more times, then let go. After standing there for a few seconds, he moved on. I didn't know what to do or how to behave in that situation. I chose the simplest option, not to move and not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped again, this time near the window. A moment later, there was a quiet knock on the glass, barely audible. The person wasn't acting aggressively, but I couldn't understand what he wanted or what his purpose was. I was alone and couldn't defend myself. After about a minute, the shadow turned away, and the man slowly walked along the terrace. A moment later, everything went quiet again. The only sound was the ocean. I don't know how much time passed before I allowed myself to sit back down. Maybe 10 minutes. I sat on the bed, listening to the water, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I lay down, pulled the blanket over myself, and tried to sleep, but I heard footsteps again. He came back. Everything repeated exactly the same way. He pulled on the door handle, knocked on the window, and then left. He returned several more times before dawn. I couldn't explain why he was doing this or what he wanted. I got dressed and sat on the bed, unable to sleep, waiting for morning. When it finally got light, I grabbed my bag and laptop and left the house. The air was cold and damp. The terrace was empty, but the sand around it was covered in boot prints. I got into my car and drove back to Ravenport. I didn't write a single note that weekend, and I never went back there again. I met Graham at a party thrown by a mutual friend. The party was to celebrate his promotion at work. I went without any expectations, just to relax and clear my head after a long week. I was sitting at a table by the pool, talking to a friend, when I looked toward the house and noticed him. He was standing near the door, looking straight at me. Our eyes met, and without hesitation, he walked over to introduce himself. At the time, he seemed safe and kind. That was my first impression. Some time passed, and we started dating. Being with him felt easy. He was tall, confident, always well put together, not overly romantic, but attentive in his own way. He remembered small details, kept his word, and never disappeared for long without explanation. After a couple of weeks, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I felt stable and secure with someone. It felt like he was exactly the kind of man I had always imagined myself with. We had been together for about 5 months when I started noticing his business trips. He would leave for a week, sometimes a little longer. He packed his things in the evening, left in the morning, and texted rarely, but consistently. Everything seemed normal. He worked as an architect and often traveled to different sites across the state. At least, that's what he told me. Still, after each trip, something felt off. For a while, he would be distant and emotionally cold. Then, after a few days, everything would go back to how it was. Sometimes, I caught a strange look in his eyes, flat, piercing, almost emotionless. It lasted a second or two, then disappeared, and Graham became his usual warm self again. I couldn't explain those moments, even to myself. I had nothing concrete to hold on to, so I pretended I hadn't noticed anything at all. Eventually, I suggested we move in together. I didn't push. One day, I simply said I was tired of living out of suitcases between his place and mine. I was already staying with him most of the time anyway. It would just be easier. He listened, nodded, and agreed calmly, as if the decision had already been made. No excitement, no resistance, just yes. He lived in a house in a quiet neighborhood of a large city. It was always clean and orderly. Very few unnecessary items. Almost nothing personal on display. There weren't even any photographs. I assumed it was just his lifestyle. The move took one day. I brought boxes, clothes, books, and a few personal things. The first week went smoothly. I relaxed. It felt like everything was finally coming together. Then I decided to clean. Not because the house was dirty, but because I wanted it to feel like home. I went through closets, folded towels, wiped down shelves. When I reached the bedroom and opened the large closet, I noticed a big suitcase. It was pushed deep inside, behind the clothes. When I tried to lift it, I realized it was full, like it was already packed for a trip. But it wasn't Graham's suitcase. I had seen him leave on work trips many times, and I knew which one he used. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I even had the right to touch it. Then curiosity won. I pulled the suitcase out into the room and opened it. Inside were women's clothes. First, neatly folded outerwear, then a swimsuit sealed in a bag, then underwear, a cosmetic pouch, a hairbrush, small travel bottles of shampoo, and toothpaste. In a narrow side pocket, I found photographs. A few of them. They showed a dark-haired woman. In one photo, she was standing near the water. In another, she was sitting in the passenger seat of a car. In the third, she was standing next to a man. That man was Graham. He looked different in those photos, more alive, more genuine. His hand rested on her waist. I put everything back into the suitcase and closed it. Then I returned it to the exact spot where I had found it. I put the clothes back and continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. Why was the suitcase packed? Why did it look hidden? My first thought was simple. An ex-girlfriend. That made sense. People have pasts. But Graham had told me he'd been single for about a year before we met. That he was focused on work. That he wasn't seeing anyone. That evening, Graham came home from work. He was the same as always. Calm. For a second, I caught that familiar look. Cold. Almost assessing. And something tightened inside me, though he didn't say or do anything. I didn't ask him about the suitcase. Not that day, not the next. I didn't want to start a conversation that could destroy something I had just begun to build. The next day, while I was home alone, I turned on the TV in the kitchen as I made coffee and breakfast. There was a news segment about a woman who had gone missing about 3 days earlier. Her family said she had been planning a vacation. At the end of the report, they showed her photo. I froze. It was the same woman from the photographs in the suitcase. The same smile, the same dark hair, the same face. There was no doubt. I couldn't even accept the idea of it being a coincidence. I forgot about breakfast and went straight to the bedroom. I knew what I was doing. I didn't try to stop myself. I opened the closet, pushed the clothes aside, and reached for the place where the suitcase had been. It was gone. I checked again, then again. I moved everything out of the way, looked lower, higher, deeper. Nothing. As if I had imagined it. As if the suitcase had never existed. I stood there, trying to recall every detail. I knew I hadn't made it up. One thought forced itself into my mind. Someone had taken it. That evening, Graham came home as usual. He had dinner and went into his office. I went to the bedroom. I didn't say anything to him. Not about the suitcase, not about the news. I sat on the edge of the bed, lost in heavy thoughts, not knowing what to do next. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that this was some kind of nightmare, but one thought wouldn't leave my head. I had moved in with someone I didn't really know, and now I was afraid for my life.